Hi, it's Tom here at FDS Quad Ventures, and we are going to be exploring the second part of my All the Gear No Idea series today. And the second part of this is on quads, more specifically on kind of quad frames and quad builds. And I said that I would introduce people to the kind of stuff that I fly. Obviously, other flying options are available. Everybody has their own opinions about quads and about frames in particular. Everyone has their favourite frames. There's like 10 billion different ones. And I don't pretend to be up to date with all this stuff. All I'm telling you is stuff that I've flown and that I was able to get to work. So there's a number of things to consider when you buy your first quad. Obviously, the space you have available to fly and the type of flying you're going to be doing are the two biggest considerations. If you only have a small space to fly in, you're not going to want a like 80 mile an hour ripping 5-inch freestyle quad, because it won't really work in a small space, certainly not when you're learning. So if you've got a smaller space, you're going to want to think about smaller quads. And also, if you live in a country with stupid restrictive quad laws, like the UK is going to be, because the stupid lawmaking Nazis in Westminster, who don't listen to any common sense whatsoever, have decided that RC flying is the devil, then there are ways you can get around that. So I'm going to run through ways to get around the current legislation and continue to fly legally and safely, because we're all about flying safely. Rule 1 from NERF, which I'm going to introduce to everybody here, which is written down nice and clear in the original rules for humans versus zombies. Remember, rule 1 is don't be a dick. Okay, D-bad. And don't be a dick really applies to flying quads. So if you're going into the park and there's kids playing and you're ripping around an 80 mile an hour 5-inch freestyle quad in amongst all those kids, you're being a dick. And you deserve to be prosecuted under the law. And currently the law protects people from dicks. It's called the Antisocial Behaviour Act 2007 if you're in the UK. And the Antisocial Behaviour Act allows for you to be fined and your stuff to be taken off you, and you to be given a righteous legal slapping for being a dick. However, in their wisdom, our government has decided that RC flyers are Satan and we all must be registered, so that if some idiot breaks rule 1, they can come around and they can persecute the innocent people who've carefully registered and completed their nice little signing in form for the government and who've registered their equipment. So now I'm not ranting about the stupidity of our government, because don't even get me started on that. I can start talking about quads, and I'm going to start with these, which are Tiny Whoops. This is an Eachine EO13, which I bought because they were cheap on Banggood, and I flew my original Eachine board for a grand total of 4 batteries before something went wrong on it, and then one motor would spin and it wouldn't bind to the controller. If you're buying something like this, they're around 50 quid. You can buy them with goggles, with a transmitter, and they are the cheapest way to get some FPV flying going. And if your space is limited, they're really cool because you can fly them inside. You can get a whole load of different ones now, up to brushless, 2S ones, and they actually make lots of different designs, and these are a lot of fun to fly. They're very cheap and they're easy to mod. This one is now running the cheapest F3, Speedix F3 type board, and all I did was I used the one with the Bayang protocol. It's available from Unmanned Tech for $9.99, and I just threw away my original Eachine board, and that now binds really nice to my Jumper multi-protocol module, which means that instead of flying this on the toy transmitter, I can fly it with Hall sensor gimbals, and I can obviously put in rates, I can put in Expo, and I can play with everything on OpenTX if I want to. You can get a programmable board for this. There's like the Acro B type boards. There's loads of different small boards for Tiny Whoops. So Tiny Whoops, lots to be done with those. You can play with them endlessly, and this one obviously has a camera included, and it flies now really nicely with that basic cheap £9.99 board. I rubber mounted it with the supplied kit, and it hovers and holds position really well. It runs 260 mAh little 1S batteries, which I found cheap on Amazon for like 8 quid for 5, and you get good flight times. So if you're getting in, that's a perfectly legit way to get in. The muscle memory will be similar to flying a bigger quad. Now we get into the realms of a proper frame, TM. This is a Tomo Quads Albert Kim crossbow. Tomo Quads are American, and they make a lot of really nice frames. They make a lot of really nice micro frames. Now micro frames offer us the chance to stick it to the man, particularly with the sub 250 rules, with the advent of smaller 1080-60 cameras and dual cameras. And obviously Cadix have just brought out a 4K camera that will fit in this shell, which is amazing. It's going to be a little heavier. The Tarsier is going to be a little heavier than, say, something like a Runcram Swift 2 or the Cadix Turtle V2. but obviously that will enable you to shoot 4K from a tiny frame like this. There are lots of what they call cine whoops, which are in the same class as this, which is ultra lightweights, and you can build those under 150 grams. You can certainly get this under 250 grams, even if you use more powerful motors like 1406s. This one has the choice of motors. It's got slotted arms so that you can run different size motors on it. It's a 2.5mm carbon base. If you're looking for a small, like a kind of 3-inch or a 150mm wheelbase quad, there's lots of frames around. Do your research, find a build you like. I tend to look for a build video that I like, and obviously there are a number of 20x20 stacks. Mamba F4 stack is a good value stack at the moment. That's on sale at UMT, Unmanned Tech. These are going to cost you as much to build as a full-size quad. There's no getting around the fact that the components will cost money. They won't, maybe the motors may be a little bit cheaper, but not by much. If you want a good setup, you're still going to spend nearly as much as you will on a basic 5-inch. So those can be made to be nearly as fast and as punchy as a big quad. And if you're under 250 grams, you currently don't have to register. Obviously, rule 1, don't be a dick, still applies if you're flying a small quad. A small quad like this can still be fast, and it still has spinning propellers, so don't go flying it through the middle of a playground. You know, something like this with guarded props and stuff, or a cine whoop with a fully guarded prop system, you can fly in closer proximity to people, but I certainly wouldn't recommend it when you're learning. I certainly wouldn't recommend it for the first 6 months at least of flying, unless you're exceedingly gifted. Proximity to people is always a bad idea, and cine whoop is something that takes skill and practice to do. So don't forget that just because you've got ducted props and you've kind of done your best to minimize potential damage, that you can immediately fly in amongst hordes of screaming children and other things and crowds and all the stuff that you shouldn't be doing. So just because you're not going to be registered and you're going to be sticking it to the man at sub 250, just remember rule 1. So that's sub 250s. The next level up beyond that is kind of budget builds in the 5-inch category. This is a really horrible, cheap fiberglass ZMR 250 frame that I bought. I think I paid a grand total of £7 for this frame. I bought it when I lost my previous 250, and I bought it just to see what it was like, really. It was so cheap that I couldn't say no. It did produce quite a lot of jello because fiberglass isn't very rigid compared to carbon. But what I've got here to show you the entry-level builds, this is my son's quad that we built for him. And the parts for this were under £140. I'll provide a link in the description box to the parts that are on this, aside from the ESCs, which we've changed to a different ESC, because the ones I wanted when I bought this were out of stock. And now this one is an F4 build. This is just a cheap, as you can see from the nice bulky metal hardware, this is a £10 frame. This is the ZMR 250 or QAV 250 type clone frame, and what I've done with this is I've fitted a 30mm standoff, so I've made it into a slam deck, so I've lowered the top deck. It's got just a clip-on GoPro mount because we're not flying hard enough to need a fancy one. You can get loads of mounts for GoPros for these, but we're using like cheap cameras, so we couldn't fit them inside the mounts. And this has been really, really good. The video from this has actually been better than mine most of the way through. Obviously, if you're a beginner, I think putting the ESCs on the arms is a really good idea, and I'll talk about that when I come to my build. Having the ESCs on the arms is useful, and there's lots of stuff on here that's pretty simple. Find a build that you like the look of, I would say, if you're getting into building a 5-inch, and follow the build videos for those. In this one, I've got the Matek F405 all-in-one. They also do the Matek F405 with the PCB, with the PDB board, the power distribution board underneath. It's like a double stack to keep the noise of all of the motor noise wires below the flight controller stack, which is good. It's harder to fit in a slam deck though, that one, because you do have to be down against the bottom of the carbon fibre. So if you're going for a low deck height, then it can be more difficult to fit that other board in. The reason I bought Matek is because they've got very good documentation. I could read their wiring diagrams and I could find all the information I needed on setting up the UARTs for the receiver and stuff, and that worked really, really well. This one is running a, I think this is a FreeSky receiver, because the jumper 4-in-1 module means we can run anything we want. And I don't think this is an EU LBT. I think this is one I found cheap that someone was getting rid of that was non-LBT. It's got LEDs on it as well for location reasons, and we started flying this line of sight. And again, I think this is the Eachine, it's just a basic Eachine multi-power level video transmitter. Motors wise, We did push the boat out on the motors. I didn't buy the really cheap motors. These are T-Motorella 40s. Unmanned Tech has these on for £12 a motor, which sounds like a lot, but they are really good. They're very punchy, plenty of power. They'll support 4S really nicely. They're not a 6S motor. If you're going to get into 6S and stuff, then I would suggest that's probably something for your second build. It's not really a first build you can do. That has real nice speed, real good punch, and the endurance is pretty good. Just cruising around, you get about 8 minutes with the right props. It's got 50/50s on at the moment, I think. I can't read what that says because it's too small. Yeah, 51/52s. These are, I think, the gem fans. You can get a 50/40 gem fan, which is probably a better choice for these, but they're really nice, they're quiet, and they're really efficient. I like them, and they look cool. So that's like a cheap 5-inch build. And then we bring you on to the kind of, not really super cheap, it's similar price to this. This is the next level up in frames. And this is a UMT Source 1 frame. I didn't buy the UMT Source 1 frame that they sell on Unmanned Tech. This came from hobbyrc.co.uk because the UMT one has exposed bolts here on the base, and underneath the flight control stack it has exposed bolts, which is naff. You don't want exposed bolts under there because if you've got the nuts on the end, it raises the height of the deck of your flight control board. It puts it up right underneath the deck here. So I do like the UMT Source 1 frame. Obviously it's community designed. It has lots of 3D printed parts available for it on Thingiverse if you want to add to it. And it's a much more rigid frame. It's got much thicker base plate and arms than the Source 1. It's heavier than the Source 1 if you make it up with most of the same components because it's got thicker carbon, but it is much more rigid. And once I got this set up right, it was better in terms of how it felt. The downsides about the Source 1 frame is that the arm spacing is slightly narrow at the front, so you will get a little bit of prop in view, and you'll see the top of the frame through the camera on a 2.1. This is a 2.1mm Cadex Ratel lens, which is quite a wide angle lens, and obviously the frame is a little bit smaller than the 250, and you've got a little less space in there. If you put the two side by side, you can kind of see that there's a bit less room in there. But it's a nice rigid frame, it's very robust. I put my ESC inside on this one. I kind of wish I'd put it on the arms now. I bought a 4-in-1 because they were out of stock again of the ESCs I wanted, and so I just bought a 4-in-1 in the end. This one's hooked up for R9M, so it's got a long range T antenna on it, and it's running the R9M receiver in there. Obviously, technically, this will have to be registered when the new law comes out because it is over 250 grams. So I'm kind of on the fence about that. Personally, I feel that by supporting such poor legislation, by actually abiding by it, you're kind of condoning the stupidity of all of these things. Hopefully, the BMFA and FPV.com and a couple of other organisations will meet with the government and they'll get an exemption for their members to this stupid law. Because to me, if you're going to join the BMFA and you're going to go to all the trouble of getting a BMFA licence, you're actually pretty qualified. So why they didn't give the BMFA exemption from registration is beyond me, because to me, you're a BMFA member, you're insured, and you're trained, and you've been properly certified, and you're not going to disobey Rule 1 because you've been trained. So that gives us the 5-inch quads. Like I say, I'll put a link in the description box to the 5-inch quad parts list for all the stuff that I put onto this one. This one uses the Matek F7 board, and again, I bought the Matek because of the really good documentation. Okay, so that's the gear that I fly, and I think the only thing I've learnt on frames is really cheap, feels like really cheap, but not so really cheap carbon, actually, was pretty good. There's a little bit of difference between these two, but not enough that it would make me go, ooh, I'll go and spend £30 again on another one of these frames instead of £10 on one of these. So if you're getting into these frames, the cheaper frames, there's nothing much wrong with them if they're carbon and they come with all the hardware and you assemble them carefully, and they can be pretty good. And so I would say that there's a lot to be said for those entry frames. And I noticed Armatan are bringing out an entry-level set of frames that are all under about 30 quid, which is going to be interesting because I refuse to spend 80 to 100 pounds on a frame. That's ridiculous. If I was a professional pilot and I flew like a god, I probably would notice the difference between an Armatan Marmot and something like this. But I am not a professional pilot. I am not some kind of FPV god. I'm just an ordinary guy. So for the man in the street, there's a great deal of emperor's new clothes about some of this stuff. You can do an awful lot with clever settings and with careful component selection to mitigate the all the gear, no idea, must be hundreds of pounds worth of stuff kind of approach, which seems to be one of the things that happens to a lot of people. So there is a potential pitfall there with frames. You know, you can really go down the money pit with those. And I did like the Source one. It's a nicely built frame and it's a nice kit to put together. And you could feel the difference in terms of quality between that and the £10 frame. But in how they flew, honestly, I liked flying that slightly more than I liked flying this when I had my original one. Maybe because I learnt on that first one and I kind of really got a feel for it and I was getting really good with it. This one I think will possibly do more in the long run because it is a little bit more robust and it's a better frame, and it will produce nicer footage than possibly this one in the long run. But you know, like I say, for the average guy on the street, the £10, £20 difference between these two frames is less of a thing. But if you want something that's going to last, then, you know, maybe spend that little bit extra. Don't go beyond 40 quid on frames for your first frame. You really don't need it. So that's my advice on frames.